Chairman, we're now live.
All right, thank you. A warm welcome to those attending and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Finance and Corporate Services Select Committee. My name is Councillor John Riley, and I'm the chairman of this meeting. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and online under the live broadcast. For those present in the room and intending to speak, please note that you will be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made public. A reminder to councillors, officers and those speaking today that you should turn the microphone button on when speaking. This will ensure you can be heard in the room and by those watching online. We're not expecting any fire drills, so if the alarm does go off, please follow the officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please switch off any mobile devices or put them on silent before the meeting starts. Please note that councillors on the committee might use their laptops or tablets during the meeting to view the agenda and paperwork. So we have a number of attendees this evening, and I'm going to ask that people introduce themselves. So we'll start on my left as we go round the table.
I'm Liz Penny, I'm the Democratic Services Officer, and I'm clerking the meeting, taking the minutes this evening.
Councillor Stuart Mathers.
Councillor Narinda Garg.
Councillor Situl Punja.
Naveed Mohammed, Head of Business Performance for the Council.
Dan Kennedy, Corporate Director for Central Services at Hillingdon Council.
Ian Anderson, Business Manager for Complaints and Inquiries.
Matthew Kelly, Head of Procurement and Commissioning.
Councillor Kishan Bhatt.
Councillor Kaushik Banerjee.
All right, thank you everybody. And Councillor Richard Lewis may be a little delayed because he's stuck in terrible traffic on the A40, but he said he will be along. Excellent, thank you very much. All right, we can go to the agenda. Apologies for absence.
Apologies have been received from Councillor Gusharan Mand with Councillor Situl Punja substituting for him.
All right. Thank you. Declarations of interest in any matters come before the meeting apart from the usual. All right, thank you. Minutes of the last meeting. Everybody, I think, is still reeling from the excellence of the presentation from our fraud team last time. It really was absolutely tremendous, and a lot of things came out from it. There have been many meetings where I've learned huge amounts, but this was certainly one of them where we learned a great deal about the work of the fraud team and their extraordinary excellence of work. And as a consequence of that meeting, quite a number of other issues have been taken forward in regard to not only their work within the council, but potentially assisting other people in terms of the work they do. And the minutes very properly reflect the entirety of that meeting. But I do think we ought to put on record, if we didn't before, and I think we probably did before, our appreciation for the work that they do and the high quality of the work that they do. All right. Any comments about those minutes? Can they be agreed? Thank you, everybody. All right. The items in this committee are in part one, so they're in public. I don't think we've got any part two anyway, so we don't need to worry about that. All right. This is the last, sadly, for us at least, if not for Matthew, of our procurement meetings. And we've asked that Matthew Kelly come back and really sort of wrap up the various other meetings that we've had, but also to help us and opine a bit on a sort of blue skies thinking for procurement. Not really as if money were no object, because that's never the case with a local authority, but certainly in terms of something more of a perfect world of procurement, and something certainly to aim at. But I will say this, I discovered and was told recently that there is something of a consultancy review or a review being headed up by some external consultants in regard to aspects of procurement. And perhaps at first I was a little concerned that would be a repeat almost of all the work we've done, and or possibly undermine or conflict, but certainly be something that was running alongside. I'm assured that's not the case, that the work that the consultants are undertaking is very different to that which we've been looking into, and certainly obviously from a very different perspective and angle from that which we've been doing in the sessions that we found so useful over these past many months. And Matthew's been to nearly all of them, and we're very grateful to him for the work that he's put in this very wide-ranging and interesting topic of procurement and commissioning. One thing's for certain, that what's become apparent is that because we are spending residents' money in our procurement and contracting and management of those contracts, we are absolutely committed to value for money and for value outcomes. There are many other benefits and side effects from the way in which we procure, but I think we all agree that the whole issue, as far as a basis for procurement and commission, has got to be value for money and high value outcomes for the spend of that money. So what we've thought about is this, that we will continue with the process as far as the work that we've been doing is concerned, and by the time we get recommendations and a draft report ready for Cabinet, it is likely that the consultants will have finished their side of things, so that if there is anything to draw from what they've concluded, and most of their work, as I understand it, is in regard to those who contract with us and their view about the way procurement works, which is, in that sense, not something that we've necessarily honed down upon because we didn't need to. We were looking at different and bigger issues. So I think the sensible thing that we're going to do is to carry on with the process as we would do anyway. As I say, get the draft report, get recommendations so that we can look at those and decide what recommendations we make to Cabinet. And the consultants' report is very likely to have then been completed by the time all that happens. And then if there's anything from their report that we want to highlight or observe about, then we can. But it's a two-track process, or a twin-track process, if you like. And it's not a question of us having to wait for their report in any way, shape or form. We can carry on and see where we get to. All right, good. So with that as opening remarks, Matthew, if you'd like to take us through what you'd like to add as a series of conclusions.
Thank you, Chair. So as Chair says, the procurement review is underway. It's a relatively short piece of work, and obviously it'll, like in a twin-track way, it will help shape the outcome of and what we want procurement to be going forward. I think the purpose of today, for me, really, committee needs to put forward some recommendations, and I want to contribute to that. Obviously, on the back of 3 sessions that we've had, I've presented some papers. We've had some really useful discussions, but ultimately that needs to develop into and manifest itself in some recommendations that go forward into your final report. So I've got a few ideas just jotted down here that I've kind of, throughout the process, I've picked up and hopefully will contribute to the final report that goes forward. As I say, it's my input to that, and you will shape it as you see fit. So I'll just spend 5 minutes, if that's okay, 5-10 minutes, just going through some of these headlines. So first of all, contract management. Now, we've touched on this throughout the process, and we really need to make sure we protect and maximise the value that from the contracts that we achieve through the procurement process. it's kind of not necessarily just at Hillingdon, but suppliers are often more adept at extracting value than customers are at protecting it and maintaining it and driving it forward. So I think one of the key points is we've got to do more and better on contract management to protect that value. Some service areas have greater delivery through outsourced service provision than others, and we often find there's more capable contract managers. But overall, there's opportunity to just improve what we're doing. The exact mechanism for what that is and what it looks like, I think, needs to be agreed. But certainly, there's a theme around contract management and its delivery and how we're doing that. Improved planning is second on my list here. So early visibility and action where we think there is a procurement coming down the road will deliver better outcomes. So if we get 12 months to tender rather than 6 months to tender, we're going to get better commercial, operational, governance outcomes than if we've only got 6 months to tender. You know, that's probably goes without saying. The procurement bill is coming down the road quite fast at us. It's not confirmed when it will go live, but probably early 2024. So the improved planning will also contribute to our commitments under the new procurement bill to provide better visibility on commercial pipelines. The procurement bill will require large contracting authorities to publish a pipeline notice forward look for 18 months for opportunities over £2 million. £2 million is not very much when we're looking at 4, 5, 6 year contracts. So we're going to have to increase that planning that we do. Next up is something that I've just termed customer of choice here. I think what we need it to be is an aspiration that we're a customer of choice for suppliers, where they invest in the contracts to deliver financial, commercial, risk management outcomes to really improve the want to work with Hillingdon rather than, oh, that's just a contract we managed to win. They want to do that. And I think tied into that is an opportunity for longer term contracts with more of a partnership approach. That this idea of longer term contracts, I know we've touched on it over various sessions, but it allows us to remove admin, even from if we've got to tender something every 2 years, there's a cost attached to that. And with limited resource, it might not be the best place to do that. So it allows us to remove administration, it allows us to build relationships, drive value for money through existing relationships. And it can, from a value for money perspective, it can all still be underpinned by benchmarking and value chain analysis to make sure we're getting the right outcome. Improved engagement with local providers. There's a few of these that have come up from kind of consistently, really. And it's clear that it's an increasing focus. But it doesn't come without its challenges. I think that's fair to say. So amongst those are the capabilities and the capacity of smaller local suppliers to meet our requirements. So we can flex our approach, and we try to flex our approach to make those opportunities more available for those local suppliers. But equally, and this is trying to get the right balance, there's a need to make sure we drive value. And I think in one of my reports we referenced this idea of a local supplier that might charge us £100,000 and come with an element of social value, and they're a local supplier, but a supplier who might charge us £90,000 or £95,000 but be based, I don't know, in the north or somewhere else, somewhere outside of Hillingdon. And there's just getting that right balance between the social value commitments that might go with a small local provider and the financial commitments around the cost. So I think there's certainly something to consider in that. I think just back to the procurement bill again, we're seeing a move away from contracts being awarded in accordance with what we call the most economically advantageous tender, and it's going to be to the most advantageous tender. Now, the word that's removed there is the economically. So that's going to provide an opportunity to place other criteria, such as your environmental, your social, your governance, those ESG criteria, which a lot of companies are looking at on a more level playing field with the financial impacts. So we think the procurement bill is going to give us more capacity to do that. And I think for me, it's how we choose to use that capacity going forward. If we're going to take a move, for example, that we want more social value, we want more social value offering from our suppliers, I think we need to make sure we've got a corporate social value policy, because that allows the procurement process to hang its hat on a corporate policy. So without that, it's very difficult when suppliers give us bids and they're proposing social value elements. We need to know how we're evaluating it, what is important to Hillingdon, and that needs to come from a social, corporate policy. There's certainly something around an increased strategic focus and perhaps a rebalancing of our risk appetite with regard to procurement. So we can't do everything. We've currently got over 100 projects under management for a team of 12, and that's not sustainable, perhaps, with the detail work that we need to sit behind some of the projects we're working on. So I think for me, in terms of recommendation, we need to focus limited resource on the areas of greatest opportunity, and that opportunity can be a financial, it can be customer service, it can be risk governance. There's a whole range of how we can define what are those most important areas, but there's an opportunity there to bring our focus and bring the resource that we have to the areas of greatest opportunity. For the other areas that might sit kind of further down the value chain, either for lower value or lower risk opportunities, then we need to look at how our process mapping and how we create a greater self-serve opportunity for colleagues to deliver tender outcomes. And part of that need for the increased strategic focus is around delivery models. So, for example, the make versus buy decision. Do we make something i.e. deliver it internally, or do we look to outsource? So those decisions need to be made, and they can only be made when that capacity exists to do the detailed work to make sure we're going to drive the right outcomes and the outcomes that councillors want to see. Next on the list was longer term contracts with more of a partnership approach. I think we've actually touched on that one. Next up was maximise the benefit from Oracle implementation. So we've got a big piece of work happening now. Oracle is our financial system, and we expect it to go live in 2024. So as part of some system-based improvements and opportunities that exist within finance, procurement, and for the organisation, we need to make sure we maximise the benefits of that. So as a minimum, that will be the opportunity to tighten spend controls around how we spend. So if we've got a contract and it's for £1 million, let's tighten the controls around that, so we can't go and spend 1.1 million before we sit down and renegotiate it with suppliers to drive that value. And also coming along with that will be improved spend reporting to influence and enable future decision making. And then finally, on my list, and these are in no particular order, is environmental. So aligned to the Council's commitment to net carbon zero by 2030. Procurement clearly have a role to play, and I've heard that throughout the sessions that we've had. There's a desire to do that, and we have got our carbon zero strategy. I think there's a key piece around how we can do that. I think there is a role to play for procurement, but equally there's a role for commissioning managers and specifying managers as to how they define their requirements. So we can go out and we can define and request, but we need to equally be mindful of the cost impact of those decisions. If we go out for services and we say we must have electric vehicles on our contracts, there could be cost implications. There's likely at this stage to be cost implications. Sorry, so that's a really quick run through some ideas, and hopefully it gives, and you may have questions now, but hopefully it gives you opportunity and to build some of those into the recommendations paper.
I think just picking up on that last point, and you've made this point before as an example in terms of electric vehicles. It may be one thing to look at, for example, the pavement cleaners, little tiny vehicles that we have, and some of those even early on, were electric, weren't they? Some weren't, but some were. But when you scale it up, for example, to I'm not quite sure what they're called these days, but I'll use the old vernacular bin lorry. We're talking that a difference of many tens of thousands of pounds before an electric version of that vehicle becomes economically viable even. And I can't remember the exact figures, but I think you were talking in terms of a traditional fossil fuel bin lorry being, I don't know, whatever it was, 400,000, and an electric one 600,000 or something. I mean, it's a huge difference. So clearly, there has to be an element of sort of cost risk against everything. Everything that's new, it starts high, doesn't it, and eventually comes to a sort of happy medium point, as it were, in terms of its cost. What do you do while that's happening? Do you spend the extra money, as it were, when you could be using that money for something else or something better? Or do you invest in a piece of technology which, by the time it becomes more viable, it may need replacing anyway because something else has overtaken it? So there's a problem there, isn't there?
Yeah, certainly with regard to the vehicles is quite a big one. There will be lots of low impact, they're probably low cost opportunities. So we can specify to say a cleaning contractor, we want you to use more environmental cleaning materials, and we can. I think the cost impact of such a thing might be minimal. So as ever in these circumstances, and I'm kind of conscious that we've been through 3 sessions, every instance will be different, and every case and every service and goods and works that we tender will have a different set of requirements. And I think from my perspective, we try and build these in where we think there's an opportunity, whether that's the environmental or the social. Sometimes it'll have a big impact, and that might not be feasible from a cost perspective. Sometimes it could be a smaller.
Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks again, Matthew, for those recommendations and proposed thoughts. Just touching on from what you said about contract management, and I know we've touched on that in previous committee meetings. I think one of the recommendations ought to be for a centralised contract management approach, particularly in light of the planning required under the new Procurement Act, whereby there is a single sort of team or area responsible for its delivery and have sort of guidance policies and procedures in place for each individual department, specific team to kind of oversee contracts together within the centralised contract management team. I think that could be quite a good starting point for better and more improved contract management.
All right, thank you. Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chairman. Matthew, just like to echo Councillor Batt's words around your really sort of great and insightful recommendations. I've just got a minor point, really, just picking up on a couple of things you said. I think definitions are important going forward. So we talked about local suppliers. What does local mean? Obviously Sunderland isn't local, so I think Harrow, Ealing, Hillingdon, that would be a good definition. So just sort of tighten up on those sort of things. And again, defining sort of what the social value policy is and what our ESG criteria is, just to make sure we have these documented, and if we can sort of circle back to them once contracts have been running for a while to see if they met those criteria, met those policies. And yeah, that was all I had to say, really. Thank you, Chairman.
All right, thank you. Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Matthew. We are very fortunate to have your expertise, and we've heard a lot of it, and I think that's been a real value. And the officer-led ideas have been really important, I think, with this review, because of its technicality, but also because of the capacity and the bill and stuff that we're not experts in. But I'm just trying to get my mind around two aspects, really. One is the how we champion quality, because we talk a lot about cost and value for money, which is important. But I worry sometimes that in our recommendations, I'd hope that we would reflect some that really show on quality, almost in the same ratio to the procurement itself. where you have the, I can't remember, 40-40 and 20, or I may have got those ratios wrong. Please, I'll go and study and come back for my certificate. But the quality, I think we really need to show and communicate to Cabinet and to residents that quality is as important as value, and they come hand in hand. It's not an either or. And so my challenge always with longer contracts is if we have limited contract management capacity, because the systems will help, that Councillor Batt mentioned, and those efficiencies, but if we have limited capacity, it doesn't matter how long the contract is, although it might provide some more capacity, if we're not able to manage them because there isn't a big enough team, it's going to undermine that quality, and it could then undermine the ability to procure different aspects because we're concentrating on management. And I wouldn't want it to be an either-or scenario. So I don't know if this is the remit of the consultants who are working with procurement, if they're looking at what capacity is actually needed with X percentage of services being procured through the council, so that at least there's a resource in that can be matched and planned for by members of Cabinet who that's relevant to. Because I also wouldn't want us to, because of the burden of, rightly burden the management the contract management capacity, looking at kind of longer contracts, better contracts, etc., that we then lose some of the other things that we've spoken about, like the market expansion with local businesses, or the use of the third sector, or the ESG things that we've spoken about, because there simply isn't any capacity within contract management and procurement. That would be a real shame to me that we lose some of these things we're trying to push just because there isn't the resource. I am extremely relieved at all the things you said. I was worried that we were going to just focus on one or two headline things and miss a lot of the locally based, value-based, but also quality-based and ESG impact stuff. So this has been a little bit more refreshing for me. The only thing that I would want us to add is more around frameworks. So I think you've got a few frameworks in mind, and we've spoken about a few frameworks, and the one I'm always going to bang the drum about is kind of the net zero target framework that might need to be in procurement, but we've spoken a lot about centralisation of things and frameworks that really give guidance on what is local, and I think the more frameworks that are produced, the better it is for the longevity and the legacy of this review, rather than just a few recommendations that have a short window. So that's the only thing that I think we as councillors need to think about, and I've liked the idea of us thinking more about frameworks, policy frameworks, rather than just recommendations that get reviewed 12 months later. Sorry for the rant, but I'm just generally relieved and appreciative of the knowledge that we have, that we're able to move things forward.
I think, and I'll bring you in straight away, but I think that also ties in with what you said about the number of projects that we've got which are unsustainable. I think that I don't know what they all are. But it may be that there is some capacity for bringing some together as opposed to them being individual. It may be that there's a need for prioritizing. Inevitably, there's going to be a finite number of resources in terms of staff and people to manage these things. So we have to be realistic. But equally, in order to reduce the number of projects to a manageable level in order to provide quality. And when I said earlier on that value for money is the absolute underpin, it is, of course, but it's twinned with being able to produce the highest quality for the value for money. Those are the two guiding principles that we have to work by. And very often it seems to me that the other things on a sort of wish list of what would be ideal may flow from that in any event, by virtue of the way we set things. But this, I'm interested, and I don't want to go into it now, but just in how we manage this 100 projects and how we prioritise them. But I'll call on you to ask your question first.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I've come in today and I'm going to ask questions that probably have been asked beforehand, but there's always a point of reiterating things. When I hear a lot of stuff being talked about value for money, what worries me, or not worries me, it concerns me, is that there needs to be an identifiable list of what value for money means, because for different organisations, value for money means different things. And if value for money here is meaning the cheapest, then that's what it needs to be. it needs to be out there, or what are the defining factors for value for money? And if we're going into the point of saying that something is going from the most economically advantageous to the most advantageous, then that kind of needs to then go into what value for money means, because that correlates with each other. And also, I would like to say that you've talked about when something is local and that being a social value, it's equally an economic value, because local means that they're paying, if it was Hillingdon local companies, they're usually paying council tax in this borough, they're employing people in this borough. They are, as a local business I am, that's what I do. We employ people in this borough, we put back into this borough, we shop locally, we drive our other local businesses. So the impacts are far greater than just social values here, and we have to remember that, whereas a company, as Councillor Banerjee said, in Sunderland is not going to be doing something like that for our community in Hillingdon. And the other thing that I wanted to just raise is that judgments need to be placed in places of technology, because the whole idea of technology is that it's always going to be fast moving. It's always going to be the next best thing. We get one phone one year, next year we have to buy another phone, or the technology has moved on. And the same is going to be through electric fleets, is going to be through the environmental progress. Ages ago we thought that it was better to have diesel fuel. Now we realise that diesel fuel is not working, and we have to go down electric, and then it's going to be hydrogen or whatever else is going to come up there. But technology is always going to move on, and we can't not do something in fear of technology moving on, because that's always going to happen. And then the cost drivers are going to get wider and wider and wider. So just want to kind of have those kind of assets. But that value for money, we really, what does value for money actually mean for Hillingdon Council? That really, really is important, because we can't just put local as social, and then that's as environmental, because it all becomes economical.
Thank you, Councillor. I think you raised some good points. Just in terms of the quality piece, we have made kind of quite large strides, I would say, in the last couple of years on that. We used to have an 80% cost, 20% quality mandate in terms of how we evaluate tenders, which you can tell is quite top heavy. We've now gone for a standard 50-50, and we've even got flex within that. So more transactional items, we step back up to the 80% cost, but more service-based, we can move to the 80% quality, 20% cost. So we try and reflect that to drive the right outcomes. In terms of the value for money piece, I accept your point, and there's a ton of definitions out there as to what constitutes value for money, and inevitably people have different views as to what constitutes. It can become a value judgment in the end. I think my kind of, if I said as a procurement team, what we're trying to do in Hillingdon, because it is always quite specific what we're doing, we're trying to reduce cost, we're trying to improve quality, and we're trying to manage risk. And those three things somewhere is around the value for money that we're driving through these processes. And we work with our stakeholders and we work with councillors to make sure we try and get that balance right. In terms of the local value is social value, there is a whole, what's called a TOMS framework out there around social value. One can not just go and pick up the TOMS framework and apply it to any tender, because what we need to understand is what is it that is important to the council. What are the values we want to get out of it? So you can go and say, well, actually, the value of an apprentice, you can go and pick up the book, is X thousand pounds. And if we get an ex-offender into employment, it might be an even higher number. Or if someone goes into a school and talks to a group of pupils, it will be another figure. And that, in theory, builds up to a financial figure, and maybe that's what you're referring to. I think what we need to understand from a head of procurement perspective is what are the things that we want to get our suppliers to invest in, and is that value sufficient to compensate, say, if we're in a situation whereby we end up spending 10% more from a contract cost on that. So I think these are the complexities of it, and I'm not saying we can't do it, we won't do it. I know that's the kind of committee's remit to decide the outcome of this. But it's got, from a procurement perspective, we've got to be able to hang our hat on something. The TOMS framework gives us some of that, but the internal piece is equally as important.
All right, thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Firstly, my apologies. The A40 was truly like a car park in places, and it was just horrendous. I listened. I do apologise that I came in at the tail end, but you were talking about cutting down on the number of projects, and I haven't heard anything about risk. And it seems to me that if you're going to cut down on the amount of projects, you need to risk rate all your projects and then work out which ones you can eliminate without causing a massive effect to the council.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I don't know the term I use, but we need to review our approach to risk management on those, I think was the term. I do agree with you. We've got, you pick the classic from a procurement perspective is a stationary contract. We might spend £100,000 a year on a stationary contract, but there's no risk as such attached to it. But equally, we could go and do a roofing job for £10,000 and it's full of risk. So it needs to be a risk focus rather than a cost focus. I would agree with that, and I think some of the number of projects is a function of how we choose to group and consolidate and aggregate our requirements, and some of the planning that we do, and perhaps we can improve at to make sure we can consolidate and aggregate those requirements so we don't have that number of projects. There is something intrinsic about a local authority that we deliver so many lines of service and so many requirements that there are always going to be a lot of projects. But there is opportunity. If we look at the number of suppliers that we have as a council, it is really quite significant compared to kind of previous roles I've been in, where we wouldn't have had many. And one of the key focuses would have been to try and reduce those number of suppliers, because there's benefit of having a smaller supply base. A lower number of higher value contracts would have a significant benefit.
I mean, some of our recommendations are going to be recommendations that are essentially requiring further work, ongoing work, additional looking into things. Some of them are going to be more practical and more immediate, and I get the sense that we're going to have a number of recommendations that fall into those two different categories, which is fine. I mean, you can't recommend immediacy for everything, and certainly not in this sphere. But one of the things that really is coming across is the sort of procurement education of those officers in the council in various different departments, and we cover such a huge range of services and different types of potential contract. But how do we get across to those who play a part in placing contracts, who have a kind of history of how they do things, getting them into a kind of new way of thinking as far as their plans for procurement are concerned? In other words, how do we bring them up to speed with what you want to do and what we want to do?
I mean, for me, that is around just shaping the strategic focus of our projects and how we need to take them forward. So if we've got the time and resource to focus on areas of spend, then I think we've got better opportunity to do that. At the minute, there's a little bit of churn in terms of, because we need to progress these things. And if we just have a little bit of breathing space, a little bit of headspace, we can perhaps go and do some of those more strategic pieces of work that I think, don't know, got a member of CMT here today, but I think that's what CMT are looking for. But I think this is perhaps where there'll be an alignment, hopefully, with the procurement review that's underway, and we'll see that.
Because inevitably, when the Procurement Act comes in, everybody whose work impacts on procurement is going to need to know the extent to which we're adopting certain things, how we're changing things, in order for them to be either compliant or be consistent with what the overall picture is.
Yeah, it's going to be a real large task, and hence the reason they're given 6 months grace for us to make sure we implement it in the right way. But you're correct. I'll be on a long list of people who'll need to relearn their jobs, because the change is really quite significant.
All right. Well, look, I think we're going to. Okay. One more question from Councillor Maiden.
Thank you. Just one thing or two things that came to mind. One was how we might be able to marry up that realigning of risk with the counterbalance of internal audit, or using some of the skills that we have in other departments to balance and check that, just for your own learning. But my thinking was, the risk of obviously drawing the contracts together is the squeeze in on smaller suppliers, and then the potential risk of a lot more subcontractors. And I wonder if there's a recommendation around, I know it's more contract management, but how subcontractors are used. I mean, in some procured pieces it's a lot easier than others, but if we go for multi-layered subcontracting, it gets further and further away from the resident and from us. It compounds it. So I don't know the answer. I'm sure there's thinking time between now and the recommendations, but something that ensures that the risk of subcontracting doesn't undermine some of the work that's being done.
Yes, that's right. Because the more in a life I had many years ago, it was perfectly clear that the further down you had the main contractor, then you had sort of main subcontractors, and then you had all these ever decreasing subcontractors down to individual trades almost in the particular industry I was involved in, and the squeeze is very top heavy going downwards, and very complicated by the time you got to the very small. I mean, sometimes sort of 2 or 3 people in a company, and that was it, kind of thing. And that was in the building industry, and it was very noticeable how they got hit, and the complaint was always the pay and the rate of or the speed of payment in those sort of circumstances. Very often, which the original client knew nothing about, because it's so far away from them. So that is something to look at. Which as a final thought, and I don't know if this is even possible, but the idea of some sort of collaboration in order to be able to allow those locally who want to. It's not everybody that will want to, because they've got their own customer base and so forth. But those that are interested, some sort of collaborative work between us and collections, maybe, of smaller businesses, to try and help them along the road of being in a position to be able to work with us. It may mean kind of more work for your team, or indeed for those in those individual areas. And not every area is going to suit very small businesses, clearly. But for those that can, maybe there's a recommendation around a thought process concerning collaborative work and training or whatever, in order to bring them along. All right, look, that's really, really helpful. And again, I just want to say on behalf of all of us, I think, how grateful we are to you. And it's been a really very, very, not just interesting, informative, but highly technical and really very helpful series of meetings that we've had with you. And hopefully we'll come up with a report and recommendations that are really making a big difference. But Matthew, thank you very much indeed for all your help. Okay, we go on to item 6, which usually follows item 5. It does. Update on the new members' inquiries process. Big excitement for this evening. So, I guess it's Ian to tell us about...
I'll introduce Chair, and then I'll hand over to
Ian
to
fair
go
enough.
through,
Right,
go
yeah,
through the
fine.
detail. The paper brings an update on the rollout and use of the new GOS portal. So the committee will be aware that full council ratified back in November the cessation of the old process and the introduction of the new GOS system to automate the management of both member inquiries and service requests. We've now had 3.5 months of that new system being in place, and this paper gives an update on progress made, the journey that we've been on, both to familiarise members with the new system, familiarise internal colleagues with the new system, some of the performance and statistics that we've seen in terms of take-up and usage. Importantly, one of the key aspects of the paper shows or seeks to demonstrate some of the learning that we've taken, both kind of working with members to improve the system and the feedback that we've used to kind of tweak it to make sure that it meets exactly what members are looking for, and then some of the ongoing work that we're looking to do over the next few months to kind of build on that progress and ensure that it continues to meet the needs of both the council and members moving forward. So I'll hand over to Ian to kind of talk through the detail.
I think Naveed's just set out the sort of the background in terms of what's happened. I think I should just start by saying that the old system, which was pretty much based on either emails or telephone system, had been in place for about 10 years. And the new system is relatively new, and it works on a more different format in terms of structured forms. But the approach of the old system and the new system is really the same, in that when an inquiry is sent in by an elected member, a response is provided. On receipt of a response, the inquiry is closed. That worked in the old system, and it works in the new system. But we've had feedback from elected members in terms of the opportunity, once a response is received, to be able to have the chance to come back and offer some sort of review or change. So at the moment we're working through with the system, and it's being tested as we speak, to actually come up with a period of 5 working days, which will allow, so once a response is sent, the system isn't closed, you then have the opportunity to come back and actually say, yeah, I'm not happy with that, or I'm not happy with this bit, and then we will then, it will just continue with that same process in terms of members' inquiry. So it gives you that opportunity to come back at officers to give follow-up questions or any things that you're not sure about. But I think the biggest change for the new system is actually in the definition, in that we've actually looked at and defined what a member's inquiry is, and introduced the concept of a service request. And to me, that actually has been the biggest change, because we've introduced something which is different, and it allows elected members and officers to process inquiries that you submit in the most efficient way. So, for example, if it's a member's inquiry, a more detailed, requiring investigation, it sets it in the right pattern. A service request, which is basically just a one-off action, which requires us to collect a pile of bricks or rubbish at a particular point, introduce that concept. So it's that concept, I think, is quite the key bit that's been put in place. Statistically, since the system was introduced, we've had 1,349 members' inquiries. Of those, 1,127 was from councillors, and we had 222 from members of Parliament. We've had 1,023 service requests. So in total, if you add up the service requests and members' inquiries, that's something like 2,300. At the same period for 2022, we had 3,169 members' inquiries, which has encapsulated everything. Of the members' inquiries that we've received, 1,214 of the 1,349 were responded or closed within that time period, and of those 1,214, 1,032, that's 85%, was responded within 10 working days. The difference between 1,214, which is those that we've actually responded to, and is that there are some inquiries which between that period will still be open because they've not been responded to. So that's just the difference in terms of the information that's provided there. We've also set out, you said we did, so we've provided the various feedback that you've provided and what we've done. But Table 5 provides you with some future development that's taking place, which should be introduced fairly soon, and it sort of sets out what the plans are for that. I'm happy to deal with any other questions or any issues.
Councillor Lewis.
Sorry, could you just say those numbers again between now and when the system was implemented, and then, because it sounded to me as though there was quite a dramatic drop in the number of members' inquiries and service requests.
So, the total number of members' inquiries that were submitted since the portal has been introduced is 1,349. 1,023 service requests were also received at that time. So that comes to just under 2,300. The total number of members' inquiries, so everything, in the same period in 2022 was 3,169. So the difference of about 700. I think that there was an expectation once you bring in the definition, there was always going to be the expectation that there will be a reduction in terms of the volume of inquiries that we receive, simply because the sheer number of service requests dwarfs the number of members' inquiries that have been submitted. So the big areas where members' inquiries are submitted are in the children's areas, the housing, but then in the area of waste, that's where the bulk of the service requests will come in, and there's just sheer volume of that would just dwarf anything else. So that's the main reason for that.
Sorry, there was a 25% drop, roughly, between the same periods. So why do you think that was? I mean, it's not the breakdown, because you can't break down the equivalent period in the previous year, but there was a drop of 25% in inquiries.
Yeah, it's the definition has changed, and the reason for that is that the volume of service requests by and large have reduced. But I can provide the statistical information in terms of the breakdown for last year with this year, if that would be helpful.
So can you break down the service requests from the previous year and what would then be members' inquiries?
You can't break that down, because what has happened last year is there wasn't that definition that was used. So everything last year was just treated as a members' inquiry. So whether you submitted a children's inquiry or a waste inquiry, what I can do is provide you a breakdown of the areas, the various service areas, which provides a breakdown of how many they submitted. From that, you can, if you look at the volume of waste inquiries, you will identify from that the bulk of those will be service requests. But the other thing I would just add is the volume of figures go up and down every year. So I appreciate that there's 25% drop, but it could just be there's just a drop in terms of the number of inquiries that have been raised.
All right, Councillor Banerjee first, then Councillor Mathers, then Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah.
So just actually building on Councillor Lewis's point and the drill downs. Actually, sorry, firstly, thank you, Ian, for another comprehensive report. It's very detailed. Is it possible to get a year-on-year comparison on the 10 days SLA target? So I know it's not a like-for-like comparison, but I'd still like to see what the percentage was last year versus this year. And I think a point I raised in committee before, we always seem to have maybe, let's say, problem type of inquiries that will never be solved in 10 days. Have you ever considered maybe having a tiered SLA, so like type 1 for certain types of queries, type 2 to give the team a bit more time to respond to, like, I'm not sure, housing inquiries, childcare or something like that. So what I'm trying to do is drill down to why 15% always breach, or there's always a percentage that breach. Is there a category in particular that's the issue? Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, it's you are right. There are definitely some areas where 10 working days will just not resolve it. The antisocial behaviour is one in particular where that will happen. Housing, the majority of times the responses can be dealt with on time in terms of housing, but in terms of the actual the SLA, it's harder to come up with a two-tiered approach. So you've got, for this it's 10 working days, for this it's a much greater number of days. At the moment, the way the system works is that you've got 10 working days for pretty much everything. But you are right in that there will be some that will take longer to respond to. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. We have all experienced how hard Ian and others have worked in order to fix these challenges and to look forward on this system. I think back to when I was first elected with the old system, and in your report on page 10 it does describe it as as inefficient. The emails are very complicated, trying to find the detail, understand in terms of that process, it was very inefficient. I think the shift from the old system to the new system, yes, there is more definition, there's a split, and I think the split itself from members' inquiries to service requests and members' inquiries is helpful. I think the service request aspect of the GOS system, although frustrating sometimes technically and has taken a lot of patience from many of us, mirrors the residents' portal. It probably needs a little bit of functionality, well, it needs more functionality for members, but it is quite effective to get those one-off actions done. I think the challenge with the members' inquiries, which are normally a lot more complex and take a lot more conversation, is that whereas the old KPI was you would get a response within 10 working days as a member, and so it was hard for the officers to decipher from the email, but from members' perspective it was member-facing, because this is when you'll get a response, and then there was an opportunity for dialogue through emails. Not particularly efficient or effective, and there was duplication sometimes, but it was that way. The challenge we've had with the new system, and I don't know if that, well, personally I believe that's because of the limits of the system, is there's no dialogue, and we're still looking at closing cases as the KPI rather than there's been a response, but actually resolution is what we should be aiming for. Now, there are some members' inquiries where they will never be resolved. Either expectations of the good-meaning residents, or just the system doesn't allow us to change the world sometimes in one street or another. That's the reality of it. Or it's a persistent problem which needs a bit more thought. I was extremely impressed with the service request and the time of the service when I asked for some offensive graffiti to be removed, and it was done almost instantly. That is exactly what people expect from their council, and if they're digitally able, they'll get that most of the time. When it comes to some of the more technical housing stuff, or even planning issues or social care stuff, it does take a lot more, and it feels like we're just writing the long emails into a system, and that it is an office. It's easier for officers because it fires off to the right people, so you lose the sometimes intuitive nature we had of the person receiving it, the team that you have, but most of the time it goes to the right place. And we're putting the majority of that information into a description box rather than on an email system, so often cutting and pasting. And I think one of my biggest frustrations with the testing time, which is maybe lessons learned, is that because we couldn't go live with it for some councillors, it was extremely difficult we couldn't test it. That you could do it at a computer, you could have conversations, and I'm someone who lives on my phone, so all of my stuff is done on my phone, and unfortunately, increasingly with this system, not saying it didn't happen with the old system, for members' inquiries, I'm having to log on to the computer, work out where the locations were that I've been out and about, trace the photos, and add stuff in. It's not as bad as I expected it to be, I will admit, but it is still more time-consuming. Something that took a few minutes to forward on an email and say, please help, now takes a councillor 20 minutes, half an hour, maybe longer. And when you're doing this in amongst your day jobs and other things, as a passion, as a vocation, it's extremely frustrating to be wasting so much time as an elected member with a system that doesn't do what it needs to. And that's for me the kind of the bottom line of it. There's lots of good things coming. There are lots of things in, but for members' inquiries themselves, I would almost suggest that the committee ask Cabinet to consider or even go with a recommendation of reverting to the old system for members' inquiries in their new definition, but keeping service requests. Now, I know it's very early days, so the proposal may be quite soon, but there is a frustration level, particularly on the councils I speak to regularly, and that is cross-party, that with members' inquiries particularly, the solution isn't adequate, the product isn't right. And I know there's a cost element to this as well, but it is extremely frustrating in terms of inputting, and then with the lack of dialogue and continual review. And if you had a CRM system like, I won't mention a brand, but let's say one of the best CRM systems that we can think of, it would be golden. It's not affordable and it's not value for money for the council, so we know that's not going to happen. But in terms of case management, what my expectation and hope was from the dashboard is good. The descriptions are better now, so you can work out what's what, and you can tally up sometimes with the emails and the emails. But I'd hope that I could manage some of the more complicated casework from this system, and it's just not possible. It's not easy to find. It's not easy to reopen and have dialogue. The emails don't come through the system. They come through your inbox, so it's not a full CRM system. And I think that halfway measure in going so far but not the full way is what's costing councillors a significant amount of time, and there needs to be some rethink around how it becomes mutually beneficial for elected members and officers and efficient, rather than the shift that's happened with members' inquiries from inefficient for officers to inefficient for members. I hope there's enough balance in there for the conversation, and I would love to push that recommendation. Maybe we revisit this in 6 months' time, but I think as a committee, I'm getting a lot of strong feedback that the system for members' inquiries is not fit for purpose.
We're not at a stage where we're making recommendations, but I do think that it is early days. It's only been a matter of months, and I think probably what we need to do is to have a time frame of when we look at it again, so that there's been time for the way in which the communications take place to bed in. And it may be that a conversation with Councillor Mills, who's been the cabinet member largely responsible for the implementation and the ongoing set of circumstances, and maybe a conversation with him about us having a look at this in perhaps more detail in maybe 6 months or so.
Shall I just say a few words on that? I mean, I think it is fair to say it's fairly early in its launch. Really, we're only at sort of 3.5 months at this point in that all councillors have used it, and actually the feedback has been very helpful from councillors. We've recently run a number of sessions with councillors and are keeping the dialogue open. I think one of the most significant changes that's coming, that Ian's described, is that there will be now a window for members to provide comments or further follow-up. So the case will remain open basically for a period of time, and the system has been developed that effectively during that period of I suppose review, the clock stops. So in other words, the officer clock isn't running in terms of running towards a breach whilst we've got that case still open. And the nature of some of the inquiries are such that they are complex, and there will be some dialogue between officers and members. New information may come back, particularly with my experiences, particularly around housing casework. You go back to the resident, they say, "Oh, now I've got new information just from my GP or whoever. Right, can you review the case now?" And so it is iterative. It's that that's the nature of casework. So absolutely right that there is that flexibility. So we're listening. We're looking to make some further development. So we would be keen to listen to further feedback once we've launched that new feature, which is probably this week or very early next. And we've briefed Councillor Mills on Monday this week of those developments. So I think our experience is that in principle, we've had some positive feedback from members. There's still clearly some further development needed, and we'll continue to develop it. And certainly we're getting much better management information now. I think what I would say though is that the system in itself is a tool to help those inquiries between members and officers and on behalf of residents. What we're also importantly looking to do during this quarter now that we're getting some better information, is actually start to drill down into the nature of those inquiries, look for patterns across the borough, and actually understand, well, why are we receiving those inquiries? What can we do as officers to be more proactive? That sort of first time principle. So actually we can prevent, in other words, we should be focusing on even preventing those inquiries, and that's where we're going with some of it. The nature of clearly some of the casework or inquiries that come to members are such that actually particularly around housing and other areas, it can be very challenging because it's a market, some of the market issues that we face. But I think what we are keen to do is to continue to develop the system. We continue to make progress, and we'd very much welcome the feedback on some of the new features that we roll out very shortly.
Councillor Lewis.
I listened to Councillor Mathers, and I understand absolutely your frustrations with the system, but I think it would be an incredibly retrogressive step to go backwards rather than go forwards. I mean, I think we've got to keep on developing and improving rather than go back to a system that was just costly and slow, but easier for the members, but it's not easier for the council. So. But I do wonder when we're going to start looking at getting an AI element within it, and chatbots, for instance. I mean, some of the questions could be answered fairly easily, and or whether we can actually get somebody doing live responses. Could you afford to have one officer just responding? I don't know. It's all. Would that be sufficient?
That would be tricky because what you've got is the breadth of knowledge that would be needed across the council for the range of inquiries would be difficult for one person to deal with. But just coming back to the Councillor Mather's point about dialogue, actually the new change will actually provide that. So if I send you a response, you've got 5 working days to come back to me and say, look, Ian, that's rubbish. And then I can then do what I can to try and deal with that. So that dialogue will happen. The other thing I would just mention is we did do some analysis in terms of how many follow-up inquiries do we actually get from elected members. So response goes, how many of those do they come back? And statistically, on what we've got, it's about 9%. So that's still quite a high figure, but it's not massive in terms of the number of follow-ups. But there are those thorny ones, which Dan had mentioned and you mentioned, which are tricky and they take time to resolve because it's not one where speed is the essence, but it's actually the quality of the engagement that needs to happen. So those would always be a struggle for 10 working days. But yeah, we can certainly do what we can in terms of the responses that we provide. But having one person to do that would be difficult because of the breadth of knowledge that would be required, which just doesn't exist. I think even Dan couldn't answer all the questions.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm
I'm not Gershon, man.
Come in now.
That's okay. Thank you, Chair. We've had plenty of conversations about this, and I thank you for the time that you and your team have taken into this. I totally agree with Councillor Mathers. I think that the service requests are, that one thing. It's great. It looks good. It works. I would like to see not it be about the response time coming back in 10 working days, but I would like to see the resolve time of something, because I get things that are closed saying that this will be done, and then I find that it isn't done, so then we have to go back to it again. That becomes a real issue, I think, and across councillors that I speak to, that seems to be quite a norm, which I would like to have changed, because really we want things to be resolved, not just responded to, because that can't be the KPI. One of the things, I don't think it's regressive to realise that something doesn't work, and then we weren't talking about going back to an old system, we were talking about using elements of the new system, but whilst thinking about the complexities when actually it's 3 or 4 departments that could be you're engaging with within a members' inquiry, not one singular department. How does that have an impact? Because I find that one department responds and then it gets closed and I have to go back and reopen something again, and there's attachment after attachment sometimes, and it is a long process. And actually, whilst we're talking about it being a cost, it being about the members, actually it's a cost to the council as well, because you're going through and doing all that work all over again. You're looking through all that paperwork all over again. You're having to respond all over again. So, somebody's salary doing work 3-4 hours in a day to go back and do that again, that is a cost to the council. We can't pretend that doesn't exist. Then it's a cost to us as well, but it is a cost to the council. So I don't see that as regressive. I just think that sometimes we have to look at things, and if they're not working, actually go back to what does work and then find solutions from that to get our progress. The other thing that I really would like to see is, I'm glad for the dialogue, because I think that dialogue is really, really important. People in housing cases specifically, you have a specific person that's assigned to that, and sometimes it's a quick conversation that can resolve something. It's a quick email back and forth, but if you have to go through a system and then be told, well, actually you need to put an ME because somebody's closed that and you've got to go back through it again, it's quite hard to kind of get through that process and find that time. And I think there needs to be a little bit better in the map navigation as well, because the amount of times this thing closes when you're out in the streets trying to do something and it doesn't work is really, really frustrating. Thank you.
I think I'll come back to the map, which is slightly different. But in terms of the 2 issues that you raised, first of all, about the ME being closed or service request being closed, or 3 or 4 questions asked and only one being answered, and it's not, and it's then closed. That isn't a system issue. That's a staffing issue, and that's something that the fact that someone's closed it when they haven't actually done the work, that's wrong, and that's something that I need to address with whoever that needs to deal with it. In terms of 3 or 4 inquiries, the system is perfectly capable of dealing with as many inquiries as you want, members' inquiries you want to submit within a linked case. So if the case relates to a family, but they then have housing issues, social care, council tax, you can still submit that in one member's inquiry, and what will happen is my team will then triage it. What then should happen is that mustn't be closed until such time as all 3 elements have responded to. And I absolutely agree with you, and that's a staffing issue. And to help, I've actually sent a communication to staff across the council at senior level and junior level to say that it's got to be responded to before we can actually close it down, including if you submit a service request and say collect rubbish from X street. If we then respond to you, say completed, but we haven't actually done that, that's wrong, and we need to address that in terms of a staffing matter. I know Councillor Mather is chipping desperately to get in, but in terms of the map functionality, that should work. Because we have sort of tested it in the environment outside, and from the feedback that we've had is that you're able to do that. But where you haven't, could you let me know, and then I'll see what I can do. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Councillor Gardner, Councillor Batt.
Yeah, sorry, so on the session that I went on, there were a number of things that came up which were sort of consistent, and I wondered, I think you said things like search functionality, saving inquiries when you're in the middle of it. That was just a couple of examples. I wondered if there was some sort of document that you might be able to produce from the sessions with the frequently asked questions which you have answers to, which you could share with all councillors as opposed to just the people that brought those issues up, because if one councillor is getting that issue, surely others will at some stage get that issue. So just bringing those lessons learned, if you like.
There is a communication coming out to all councillors very soon, and it addresses a number of the issues that have been raised at the meetings, the changes that we've put together, it's just not there yet at the moment, Councillor, but it is coming out. There is also a training manual that we've produced, which also has videos and written communications in terms of how to do things. But I think what happened is, and I guess I should have made that more highlighted, is that when I sent the welcome introduction communication around, the focus was very much about how to log into the system. But in that email was actually a link to actually the various training manuals that are there to use. I need to highlight that. But when the communication comes out very soon, it will provide you with answers to many of those points.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, what I was saying, I understand there was a manual, but through the sessions that you've held, I think there must be a pattern of like things that a lot of councillors are finding, as opposed to just everything. So maybe just pick out the top 5 issues that people are having that you can overcome, as opposed to everything.
Yeah, happy to do that.
All right, thank you. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Chair. Sort of having worked in the sort of tech industry, within the tech industry for a long time, I know that the first version is always going to be not the be-all and end-all, and it's always going to have teething issues. What's quite refreshing to see is Table 5, and I think the focus should be on solutions, because this is clearly a tech product that can evolve. And I'm a big believer in sort of technology saving costs and driving efficiencies. What's really refreshing to see is that I know that one of the challenges was that it was hard for our ward colleagues to see what was going on, and that was one of the biggest issues. I can see it's really good to see that that's kind of GDPR is not really an issue here. I never thought it would have been, but it's never an issue. And also, it'll be quite good to understand a bit more about how ward colleagues will be able to see inquiries and how that process actually works. I also know that within the tech industry, there's loads of existing APIs out there that we can tap into. That is much more cost effective than building something yourself, because there's stuff out there which you can reuse readily available. One such API is called Talk2, which a lot of my clients use, and that sort of AI based can respond to questions and queries quite easily. So I'm just wondering to what extent we're looking at these APIs to help develop this further.
Absolutely right. So we're looking at all options actually, and certainly, I mean, just to sort of illustrate the point, not so much this area, but we're looking at robotics and AI, automation in a whole range of different areas. I think our priority at this point in time is just to obviously land this and get it sort of embedded, and we're sort of giving ourselves a good 6 months or so. But certainly we would be and are open to looking at all options really, and anything that kind of improves both the member experience and the customer experience is absolutely the right thing to do.
Great. I only understood about half of what Councillor Batt asked, but never mind. Too many letters. You can tell me all about it later. Okay, Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. If I just may raise 2 points. On the GDPR one, it talks about that it's okay within the ward but not outside the ward. So in my mind that does 2 things. It really affects inquiries that come from people outside of your ward who want a councillor outside the ward. It doesn't happen that often, but people do want a particular councillor or party or whatever it might be for whatever reason, or they've moved wards but they're still their original case was with yourself. So you're then not able to share according to this with those wards without written permission. That's one thing. But it also then completely undermines the leader consent process. Where you have to get agreement by your leader, because if your leader isn't in your ward, you're not able to share it without written consent. So that may be something that wants to be looked at in terms of the constitution or the implications on that, so we're not digging ourselves bureaucratic holes or getting ourselves in trouble with GDPR. My main point was there was a significant amount of planning with this, and it was extremely helpful for myself to be involved with the testing stuff and gave me some real insight. But my impression throughout has been, and I don't know if this has been a genuine restriction or a perception, is that we already had the GOS system elsewhere, so it was lining up councillors' expectations with what GOS could do. And I think there's been some honesty about that in different forums and spaces, but often that isn't always the most helpful approach for the whole thing, which is why my service request works really well, but ME things, we may need to consider something else, is more a looking forward. If there is another system that can be compatible with the GOS system, and I know that cost is always going to be a factor, it may need to be considered. It would be useful to know, probably can't divulge here in public, but useful to know what other systems were considered as part of that planning process. This is about councillors learning to do things differently, and I think there's a willingness in the majority of us to do that, and we want to save time as well. I think there's been a lot of lessons learned about how officers and councillors across the board can work together, and I think it would be useful to capture those in some way at this point and share them with other developments, with other things, because we're a funny breed sometimes, us councillors, and the better that we can work together and innovate, it helps our residents, and the council can be more efficient. I just worried that a lot of time we've been trying to shoehorn us into something, or that the expectations could have been set slightly differently, but I've generally been very grateful of the continuous work, and personally I know that all three of you have responded to almost every detail, so my thanks as well for that.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, I'll take one last question from Councillor Bernard.
Thank you, Chairman. Very quickly, Councillor Batt got me thinking, and some of the answers. In the future, would it be possible to do any self-service reporting? So in the sense, I'm just thinking of the categories, and maybe come up with heat maps. So for example, maybe some wards, I'm just making this up, are more prone to, let me just have a look here, waste, antisocial behaviour. Can we see that something? Okay, brilliant. Great.
What we would do is, it will be still a little bit clunky, but we'd download the data and we'd plot it in GIS and just do some trend analysis. And but it is, you're right, actually it's about really digging down into the inquiries and seeing, well, actually, what is this telling us?
All right, look, well, I mean, obviously, because it's new and there's a lot of observations about aspects of the process and practicalities, and I speak as one who's benefited hugely from Ian's help and Claire's, finding these sorts of things particularly taxing. But I think we will come back to this, and if we have a in our work programme, maybe we'll think of a sort of time scale, but a review in a certain time scale, maybe 6 months or something along those lines, to have a really good bash at it, then I think that would be quite helpful, because inevitably, as with in the old days, Betamax and VHS and all the rest of it, different things happen at different paces and different times, and having the best system doesn't always give you the right system. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed, as ever. Lovely to see you, and thank you for your input today. Thank you. Right, item 7, Cabinet Forward Plan. To a large extent, that's really just for us to note and to observe, and anything that anybody wants to particularly pick up on, I think the best thing to do is to sort of email me. Do we still have it? Yeah, we do. Email me and let me know about any particular issues. We'll be dealing with, when's our next meeting? June. 14th, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the 14th of June, Chairman.
Yeah, after the AGM. So we'll have the opportunity to go into further aspects of the work programme. But in between time, if there are any other topics that you want to pitch into the work programme, do let me know, and I can talk to Liz and Mark about that. Councillor Maidens.
Thank you, Chair. Just some thinking. So, looking at the finance side of this committee, we review the budget before it comes at our part of the budget, etc. But in terms of finance, the budget outturn in June, not beforehand, but maybe having an item, and it may have to be part 2 afterwards, just to keep the committee well informed of where the financial position was at the end of the financial year, but also if there was any comments or thoughts around like variations between budgeted and expenditure and future programmes, of how the financial controls were in place. This isn't about scrutinising services expenditure, and it's about financial controls and things, and it would be a good. It may have to be part 2, it may have to be part 1. That would be at your discretion, but it would be a good way to provide scrutiny isn't the right word, but support to that portfolio in terms of accountability and general, feedback and support for financial robustness. I hope that makes sense.
All right. Councillor Lewis. Thank you. Councillor Mathers, are you saying corporate services, or are you saying the whole council with that?
So it would, because we have a financial remit, it would be the whole council, because it's about how it's not about how our services spent, because otherwise you'd have to replicate that with every committee for financial. But it's just generally where there were pressures here and there, how did the council manage them, and what will they do in future if they know there's a growth area to, financially, to make sure there's the finance. Audit do some of this, but it's just a bit of financial oversight. The savings programs to achieve all those bits for this committee, rather than breaking down across all of the committees of financial aspects, because we have a remit for finance as a whole, as well as corporate services.
Well, we do. Yeah, we do. But the trouble is that we've got 12 service areas in our responsibility region, and it would. I'm just trying to think about how we construct such a thing.
But that surely is in the cabinet papers every month. There's the cabinet paper that explains what the outturn of the previous but 1 month, and it's fully explained what the pressures are and how they're being ameliorated.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our responsibility. If there was a call-in on those papers, it would come through this committee. So I guess my reason for doing this is to ensure that the council have the risk management in place for any pressures that have turned over into the new financial year from the previous one, how that might affect the budget. We don't need to know all of that information, but it needs to be checking the ticks and balances of, the risk management, the different approaches that may be taken in terms of financial controls. If, for example, as we've seen, the banking sector is fragile, and therefore, what the finance team might be doing in order to make sure that short-term or long-term investments are monitored in a slightly different way this year rather than they did last year, how they've learned, what they've learned from. It's about financial management and accounting, and less about individual service areas.
I think for these purposes, I think if you and I have a conversation about this offline, because I'm at the minute struggling to think what the difference between what you're asking for and what's in the cabinet papers anyway and what the audit committee do is different. So let's talk about it offline. If everybody's happy with that, we can try and sort that out. All right. But as I say, any other because of course we are split between finance and corporate services. We've got, as I say, the 12 service areas, which are essentially, you might just as well write down everything. And similarly, I have conversations with the cabinet member portfolio holders, leader of the council, member for corporate services, and member for finance, in terms of various issues. And it was a happy coincidence, of course, that we alighted on procurement, because it was something that certainly each one of those cabinet members were very interested in. Good. All right. So what I said before about the process of the procurement report, in terms of how that sits with the consultancy aspect, I was very insistent that we should carry on with our report and not wait for the consultancy, because as it turned out, it was very different to what we were doing. What concerned me initially was that perhaps it was kind of going over all of our ground, which would have been a bit of a waste of time, but it wasn't, so that's all right. And Matthew was happy to the fact that it was going to be, if anything, complementary to what we've been doing rather than similar. All right, good. So that's that. And unless there's any other issues or matters, well, we sort of looked at we've looked at both those. Okay. So unless there's anything else, I shall close the meeting. Okay, thank you.